That should do it.
Could not say. What if I told you? The Nephilim, those giants born of angels and women, once held a secret so terrifying that they wrote it down in their final days, not in pride, but in fear. It was called the Book of Giants. Within its pages were dreams that haunted them, visions of chains of fire and of a flood that would swallow their kingdoms whole. They knew their strength could not save them. They knew their towers would fall. And in desperation, they carved.
Hi, Di. Good to see you. The cat didn't make it home last night. I went out and checked this morning. He still hasn't come home.
Of their terror into words and confession written by the very monsters who once ruled the world. But the Book of Giants was not meant for men to see. It was hidden, scattered, and almost erased. Yet fragments of it survived, enough to reveal what the Nephilim feared most. This is the entire story of the Book of Giants, what the Nephilim wrote in fear, and why their words still echo like a warning across time. Before we begin, subscribe now, because here we keep alive the stories that power Tron.
Yeah, I'm hoping that he'll go. I'm hoping the Pound will have him because he's got a microchip and all that.
To silence. And when you share this,
hey, Lynn, good to see you.
You're preserving the last words of the giants themselves. Stay till the end, because once you hear what the Nephilim confessed, you'll never see their story the same way again. Now close your eyes and return with me to the trembling hands of giants and the words they left behind. The sky was neither night nor dawn when the first hand trembled above the parchment. It was that forgotten hour between times.
How's your health, Lynn?
Whispered, and the sun had not yet lifted its gaze.
Well, more than how's your dialysis?
Shadows, the truth became impossible to
More
ignore.
to the point.
Mahaway sat alone in the hollow of a hall made not from pride, but from penance. Around him, the great bones of his kindred leaned against the winds, their ivory ridges catching moonlight like ribs of forgotten beasts, too sacred to bury and too monstrous to mourn. The scrolls before him quivered gently in the breeze, not from wind, but from memory, as if the skins they were written on still remembered the flesh they once clothed. The ink was thick and dark, drawn not from roots or wells, but from a mixture he had prepared with his own grief. The ash of the first offering he ever made in silence, the blood of the last innocent creature that wandered into the camp before the flood came, and the bitter resin of a tree that had stood watch since the time of the Watchers. He stirred it not with joy nor with fear, but with a burden too heavy for giants and too ancient for men. He did not write to be read. He wrote because silence was beginning to forget them. Each word he etched into the trembling parchment felt like a blade drawn across his soul. The names he recorded had not been spoken in generations. Some of them were buried under cities, long since drowned. Others had been hidden behind veils of fire and judgment. He began with his father's name, though his hand hesitated when forming the first glyph. His father had come from the stars, not in radiance, but in rebellion. One of the 200 who chose earth over heaven, whose hearts burned for mortal women, and whose eyes grew dim when they saw the destruction their desire had birthed. Mahaway had never seen his father cry, but he remembered the sound of his breath breaking when the decree came down from above, that the Watchers would be bound, buried, and forgotten, that their sons, the Nephilim, would be given over to the swords of men and the fires of divine retribution. Mahaway had not cried then. He had only watched wide-eyed and still as the sky that once sang over their heads turned to iron. He remembered the laughter of his brothers. Before the flood, before the silence, they believed.
Yeah, prayers as well, Lynn.
They carved their names into the sides of mountains, their faces into the bellies of valleys, their dreams into the hearts of kings. They taught men to craft weapons, to bend metal into blades and pride into crowns. They offered secrets in exchange for temples, taught charms in exchange for obedience. They believed they were building eternity. But now Mahaway looked around, and none of those voices remained. Their temples had become tombs, their statues had collapsed into rubble. Their chants had been replaced by silence so deep it echoed louder than drums. He was the last one who remembered what it felt like to be unafraid, and so he wrote, not like a scribe, but like a mourner, not to preserve history, but to carry grief. He wrote about the first time he saw a man stand against a giant, not with a sword, but with a prayer. The giant had laughed, Mahaway had laughed, but the sky did not. That night, the moon turned red, and the air grew heavy. The giant did not return from that encounter. The man was never seen again, either, but the wind that came afterward carried something different. It was no longer awe or fear. It was something deeper, a trembling beneath the surface of creation itself, as if the divine had begun to watch with judgment instead of patience. Mahaway's ink began to run thin, but his memory ran deeper still. He remembered the city of stone they had built under the shadow of Mount Hermon, where the Watchers first swore their oaths in blood and bond. The city had no name, only a sound, a low, humming vibration that resonated through the bones of those who entered. They said it was the language of the stars. Others said it was the groaning of the earth, already mourning what it would be forced to swallow. In that city, he had learned to speak to the wind, to shape iron with thought, to call fire with a gesture. But in the quiet moments between rituals, when the others feasted and laughed, Mahaway would walk among the ruins of older things. Bones too large even for his kind, stones that whispered warnings in languages no longer spoken, altars that pulsed with dread. Something had come before them, and whatever it was, it had been forgotten for a reason. Did not dare write those things. Some memories were not meant for parchment. Some truths still bit back. Instead, he wrote of the children, the ones born not
We
of
love you,
boxes
Lynn,
or
that's
of
why.
metal, but of frightened humans who bore the mark of corrupted blood. Children with too many eyes, children who could not cry, children who
Lynn, there's about 6 or 7 of us, all from the same crew.
disappeared under moonlight or were born knowing names they were never taught. Most of them did not live long. The ones who did often vanished into the deserts, swallowed by sands that seemed to hunger for silence. Mahaway remembered one, a girl with skin like molten stone and a voice that could calm storms. She had touched his arm once and said, "You will remember me, even when the sky forgets my name." He had not seen her again, but her words never left him. They hummed beneath his breath even now. He paused in his writing and listened, not to the wind, not to the silence, but to that inner stillness, the place where divine memory speaks not in words, but in ache. He wondered if others had felt this before the flood came, if the Watchers, in their final moments, had reached for heaven not in defiance, but in regret. If the stars had wept when they saw their brothers fall. He did not know, but he could feel something watching now, not a presence, not a spirit, but perhaps history itself, as if time had paused just briefly.
Just look how strong they look. They just look super strong as well. They don't look just like giants. They look super strong.
To listen. His hand continued. The words came slower now, not because he was tired, but because he was careful. These final names were sacred. The ones who had tried to repent, the ones who walked into the flood willingly, hoping their last breath would be carried upward like a prayer.
Introducing the pristine paradise of Palau. Add this trending destination to your travel radar with our exclusive holiday packages on sale now. Perfectly packaged with up to $3,300 bonus value.
Gold standard. Gold dust. Pop. Gold solid. Gold. You're worth your weight in gold.
Weeknights don't have to feel like an uphill challenge. Come home to HelloFresh. Super easy recipe.
He wrote of one giant who had torn down his own temple with his bare hands, whispering a single verse he had learned from a prophet in chains. He wrote of another who had laid down his sword and spent his final days tending to wounded men, even though they spat at him, even though they feared him. Mahaway wrote their names with reverence. These were not saviors. They were broken beings who, in their final breath, chose silence over pride, and that, he believed, was sacred. He wiped the ink from his fingers and looked once more at the scrolls before him. They were not beautiful. They were jagged, stained, trembling, but they were honest. They were the last honest thing his kind had ever offered.
Yeah.
He did not know if they would survive. The winds might scatter them. The floods might consume them. Men might find them and burn them. But still he had written, and that too was sacred. He whispered a name he had never spoken before, his own. Not the one given to him by his father, not the one chanted in war, not the one feared by men, but the name he heard once in a dream, when a voice like thunder, wrapped in silk, called him not as a giant, but as a soul. And in that whisper, the scroll shivered, and in that silence, the wind returned. And in that moment, he asked the question that had haunted him since the first temple crumbled. If the last of the giants dies with a prayer on his lips, will heaven hear him still? But the desert had no end that morning. There were no footprints behind him, no clouds ahead, only silence, wide and endless, waiting to swallow whatever moved through it. Mahaway's steps were slow now, not because of age, but because each movement felt like pulling memory through mud. Behind him, the scrolls had been hidden beneath stone, not for fear of theft, but in hopes the earth would carry them forward when man's hands forgot how to hold truth. He no longer trusted cities or temples. He trusted wind. He trusted sand. He trusted the places that could not lie, for they had no voices to twist, no pride to protect. His body no longer cast a strong shadow, and his voice barely stirred the air, but he still walked, not toward a destination, but toward a question that had followed him across every ruin, behind every fallen brother, through every whisper that once wore the shape of a god's silence.
What the heck could the question be, I wonder? We're going to find out in a sec.
The mountain he approached had no name, not in the tongues of men, not in the prayers of angels, not in the curses of giants. It stood outside maps, outside memory, outside mercy. They said the first watcher fell there, not from heaven, but from grace, not because he disobeyed, but because he wept at what he had become. Mahaway had never seen the peak with his own eyes, but he had seen the drawings, carved by shaking hands into cave walls that refused to collapse. A great shape, wings broken, knees pressed to the earth, hands over eyes as if sight itself had become unbearable. Beneath the carving was a single line in a dialect older than sin. He saw what was born of him and begged for blindness. Mahaway had read those words as a child, long before he knew their meaning. Now, as he approached the trembling edge of that same place, he understood. He too had seen what was born of them. He had seen cities of gold that drank the blood of children in silence. He had seen kings offer their daughters to beings with no mercy left in their bones. He had seen books bound in flesh and read only in darkness. He had seen men with too many faces and women who bore wounds that healed as curses. He had seen fire fall from the sky, not from war, but from...
Hey, it was good to see
He
you.
had seen the face of a man, a prophet perhaps, standing still while towers collapsed, his lips moving not in fear, but in surrender. Mahaway had asked him once when the earth had split open why he did not run. The man had only said, because the sky is watching. Mahaway had never asked.
Oh, come up or down, Moo.
Now, as he stood before the nameless peak, his breath caught in his throat, not from awe, but from memory's weight. The wind here did not blow, it listened. It held its breath, as if afraid to disturb whatever truth lay buried beneath the surface. Mahaway reached into the folds of his robe and withdrew a single shard, a sliver of bone.
I wasn't over here. That was your comments on my Ausd code, wasn't it?
Smooth and pale, taken from the rib of his first fallen brother. He had kept it not out of sentiment, but because it
Yeah, I
refused
thought
to
so.
rot. Every other part had turned to dust, but
I was. Have you got Facebook?
this piece remained, as if some part of his brother's guilt had bound itself to flesh, refusing to leave. He knelt beside the rock and pressed it into the ground, whispering no words, asking no favors. The act itself was the prayer, and when he stood again, the air had shifted. Not warmer, not colder, but deeper, like the space around him had thickened, waiting for him to speak. But Mahaway did not speak, not yet. Instead, he remembered that
Thing about it, I wasn't over here. The most beloved movie in the world. Also, it has, look what it's got behind it. It's unbelievable how it worked out.
night before the flood, not the one spoken of in stories, but the real night, the one without fire or thunder, only stillness. The giants had gathered in the city of hollow trees, each one carrying the weight of their deeds, not in scrolls,
Oh, you don't?
but in
Okay.
silence. None of them spoke of the coming judgment. They had known for years it was near, not because of signs in the sky, but because of the cracks in their dreams. Dreams where the stars fell not like stones, but like tears. Dreams where children turned their faces away from their fathers. Dreams where even the moon refused to shine. Mahaway had watched as one by one his brothers laid down their weapons, not in surrender, but in fear. Not of death, but giants do not fear death, but of being remembered, of becoming parables, of being rewritten by those who never knew them, never bled with them, never tried to undo what had been done. That was the true fear, not drowning, not divine wrath, but being misunderstood. He had not slept that night. Instead, he wandered the edges of the forest where the trees grew so closely, even light could not breathe. There he found a woman, not human, not giant, not angel, something between. Her eyes reflected light that wasn't there. Her breath smelled of myrrh and forgotten rivers. She looked at him and said, "Will you be the last one to remember or the first one to repent?" He asked her what the difference was. She only smiled, then vanished into the dark. He never saw her again, but her voice stayed. Now, in the silence of the mountain's base, he opened his mouth, and for the first time in many years, he did not write. He spoke, not loudly, not with authority, but with the softness of someone who has nothing left to lose and everything left to tell. He spoke the names of the cities that vanished. He spoke the names of the rivers that no longer flowed. He spoke the names of his brothers, even the ones who betrayed him, even the ones whose hands had written their own condemnation in blood. He did not weep. His tears had dried many years ago, somewhere between judgment
I forgot to tell you guys, we weren't raptured.
and memory. But his voice cracked, not from
We knew it. We knew there was no rapture. We picked it.
grief, but from the strain of carrying silence too long. The mountain listened. It did not shake. It did not open. It did not burn, but it remembered. And that, Mahawe thought, was enough. He turned to leave, but a sound stopped him. Not wind, not thunder. A low vibration like the hum of the earth itself breathing. He paused, listening. And from the stones beneath his feet, he heard it. Not words, but rhythm. The same rhythm he had written in his scrolls. The same pattern found in the heartbeat of the girl with molten skin. The same cadence whispered by the prophet who feared nothing. It was as if the earth itself had become a scroll, and he, the last reader. He dropped to his knees, pressing his palms against the dirt, his forehead against the stone, and whispered, "If there is still a place for us in the divine memory, let it be not as monsters, but as mourners." The wind returned then, softly, brushing past his face like a mother's forgotten touch, and in that moment Mahawe understood. The Book of Giants was not just words, it was a bridge between ruin and mercy, between wrath and repentance, between what had fallen and what might still rise again. And yet, even as this truth settled into his bones, another question rose within him, heavier, deeper, more painful. If a soul writes its final confession in the sand, and no one is left to read it, does heaven still listen? The flood had come and gone, yet the world still wore its scars like unhealed wounds stretched across the skin of the earth. The waters had receded long ago, but the silence they left behind had taken root, growing inside mountains, sleeping beneath valleys, whispering in the hollows of ancient trees. Mahawe did not return to the cities of his brothers. He wandered instead through places where even birds no longer sang, where the earth had cracked open in sorrow, and the bones of forgotten giants jutted out like broken pillars from beneath layers of dust that no wind dared disturb. Each step he took was not for escape, nor for penance, but for remembrance. He had become the last flicker of memory left in a world that had tried so hard to erase what had once ruled it. And though no scroll remained in his hands, the story still lived behind his eyes, carried not in pages, but in breath. He crossed valleys where entire languages had vanished. Tongues once chanted by Nephilim priests now existed only as echoes trapped in stone. He heard them sometimes in the wind, strange syllables that struck the heart rather than the ear, full of meaning too heavy for modern mouths. They reminded him of the days when words were power, when to speak was to summon, and to name was to create. But now, even the mountains that once echoed those names stood quiet, their crowns broken by time, their roots strangled by regret. In these ruins, Mahawe saw not the fall of a race, but the collapse of pride. They had built too high. They had reached for stars with blood-stained hands, forgetting that the sky only opens to those who kneel. He passed through a forest that had no memory of fire, where the trees grew twisted as if trying to unsee what they had once witnessed. The air was thick with the scent of old sorrow, a damp, heavy silence that clung to the skin like ash. Beneath one of the elder trees, he found a stone altar.
Okay, something went wrong with the volume.
It bore the faint inscription of a name long erased from common speech. A name not of a giant or a man, but of something in between. He knelt before it, not in worship, but in acknowledgement. This had been a place of prayer once, a place where someone, perhaps a fallen one, perhaps a mother, perhaps even a child, had whispered to the sky for mercy. He could feel it in the stone, as one feels warmth long after the fire has died. He touched it gently, and for a moment, he no longer felt alone. At night, his dreams grew heavier. He no longer saw visions of battle or fire, nor the faces of his brothers lost in flood and flame. Instead, he saw children, small, fragile, unknowing, walking through fields of tall grass, holding hands, speaking in words he could not understand but somehow remembered. In their eyes was no fear, only wonder. They laughed at the stars, not in defiance but in delight. And in the center of their gathering stood a single stone scroll, glowing faintly with the pulse of memory. When Mahaway reached for it in his dream, he awoke. Always. With tears he did not remember shedding, and prayers he had not spoken aloud. He understood then that memory was no longer enough. Words carved in stone, inked in blood, or hidden in caves would not carry the weight of their failure. The Book of Giants had never been about preserving their greatness. It had been a final offering, a chance, however broken, to be seen not as destroyers, but as beings who had once tried to unmake their own destruction. But paper burns, stones shatter, even bones turn to dust. What remained then? What could carry their confession across time, beyond flood, past fire? Only breath, only soul, only the divine echo that passes from one heart to another, when truth is spoken not for gain, but for grief. Mahaway climbed the last hill before the horizon disappeared into endless sand. His body ached with the weight of years, not in muscle or bone, but in memory. He carried within him every name he had ever spoken, every face he had ever failed, every moment that could not be undone. As he reached the top, he looked out over the endless horizon, a sea of golden quiet, soft and holy in its stillness. Here he felt it, a pull beneath his ribs, a tremble in the earth, a whisper not in words but in knowing. This was where he would speak his final truth. He fell to his knees, not from exhaustion, from reverence. He pressed his forehead to the dust and let his breath melt into the soil, letting the world hear what no scroll could ever carry. No cry came from his lips, no chant, no scream, no song. Only a stillness deeper than silence, a surrender so complete that even the wind dared not interrupt. In that breath, he released every name. In that breath, he forgave every betrayal. In that breath, he gave back what had never been his to keep: his strength, his story, his sorrow. The sands shifted, not with violence, with care, as if the earth itself had bent to listen. And somewhere far away, beneath a ruined city, beneath a broken altar, beneath the oldest stone, something stirred. A scroll, once thought lost, now glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat waiting to be read. Mahaway did not see it. He had closed his eyes for the final time, not in death, but in return. His body would fade, his bones would vanish, but his breath, his prayer, would remain, carried not by angels, not by giants, but by those who still wonder. And in the soft quiet that followed, the earth asked no questions, because it had finally received an answer. What divine lessons can we carry from this moment into our own lives today? How does this sacred truth resonate within us? Long before the waters rose, before the earth cracked beneath the weight of broken vows, there was a night when even the stars blinked in hesitation. The heavens, once adorned with endless light, dimmed ever so slightly, not from distance, but from grief. It was on this night that Shemihaza stood alone upon the cliffs of Ardis, his wings folded not in pride, but in shame. He had been among the first to descend, not in haste, but with solemn certainty. believing his oath to be worthy, believing his love to be stronger than law. When he touched the soil of the earth, it had welcomed him, not with fury, not with rejection, but with silence, as though the land itself understood what heaven could not forgive. Yet now, as he watched the flames of his children's cities flicker in the distance like fading stars, he realized the silence was never consent. It had always been a warning. He had sons not born in holiness, but in hunger. They were tall, radiant, terrifying. They bore his strength, his voice, and the same restless thirst that had driven him from the firmament to the flesh. He named them not after constellations, but after storms, for their presence always seemed to summon the wildness of the sky. They did not crawl as children. They stood. They did not speak as babes. They commanded. He watched them raise temples from nothing, forge weapons from whispers, and drink from rivers they had not asked permission to touch. And still he loved them, not with blindness, but with a trembling affection only a father who knows the cost of his own sin can feel. Each time they called his name, he answered, not because he approved, but because he feared what silence would do to them. The first time he saw one of his sons kill, it was not in battle, it was in demonstration. A smaller man, one of the shepherd clans, had refused tribute. His son had taken him by the throat, lifted him high into the sun, and crushed the breath from his body, not with hatred, but indifference. Shemihaza had arrived too late to stop it. He stood at a distance, wings trembling, and for the first time since his fall, he wept. Not for the man, not even for his son. He wept because he recognized in that moment what he had brought into the world. Not a being, but a wound with a name, a wound that would not close. And yet that night, when his son came to him, with blood still warm upon his hands, and asked, "Did I do right, Father?" He said nothing, because he no longer knew what right was. He remembered when he first descended, when the sky had still echoed with the voices of those who remained above. There had been thunder then, not of judgment, but of pleading. A cry not from wrath, but from longing, begging him not to sever the bond between what was sacred and what was desired. But his feet had already touched the mountain. His heart had already chosen earth. And in that choice he had exchanged eternity for lineage. Now that lineage bore swords instead of prayers, carved cities instead of covenants, and bled the ground dry with rituals no prophet had taught. He walked among his sons like a ghost in daylight, seen but not heard. They celebrated his name in their halls, carved his likeness into their walls, but they did not see the sorrow behind his eyes. To them, he was a god, but to himself he was a mistake that never learned to stop echoing. There was a son who built a tower. It reached not for heaven in reverence, but in defiance. Each stone was inscribed with curses meant to unbind the decrees that had sealed the watchers from returning to the stars. Shemihaza stood at the base of that tower one morning, his fingers tracing the sharp edges of the words etched in hatred. His son stood above him, arms outstretched, proclaiming freedom, proclaiming vengeance, proclaiming the end of divine silence. And yet, when their eyes met across that distance,
Diane, I don't think Kimmel's going to last long.
stone between them, sky above them, there was something in the boy's gaze that still looked like longing, as if somewhere beneath the rebellion there was a small voice still asking to be loved. He wanted to call out to him, to say something that might unbuild the tower, but his mouth would not open. Not because he was forbidden, but because he feared it was already too late. There were nights when Shemihaza would walk through the cities his sons had built, cloaked in shadow, listening. He listened not to their prayers, for they had none, but to their dreams. The cries of children born with eyes too wide, the murmurs of mothers who feared their own bloodlines, the drunken boasts of sons who believed themselves beyond death. And in every voice he heard himself, scattered, broken, multiplied. He walked past shrines where his own name lay invoked to bless war. He passed pits where slaves were buried beneath the foundation of altars. He saw scrolls made of skin, bound with bone, inked in tears. His children had taken the fragments of heaven they inherited and forged them into chains. And all he could do was watch. One morning, after a storm had swept through the eastern edge of the valley, he found one of his sons lying beside the body of a lion. The beast had been torn apart, not for food, not for defense, but for sport. The boy, barely more than a child in years, but already towering like his kin, wept over the creature. Shemihaza approached slowly, cautiously, and placed a hand on the boy's back. The boy did not flinch. "I didn't want to kill it," he whispered, but the others laughed when I didn't. They said I was weak. Shemihaza felt the boy's shoulders shake. He remembered then the first time he had ever disobeyed. It had not been out of pride, but out of fear of being forgotten. He held the boy close and said only, "You are not weak for mourning what you kill." It was the only true thing he had spoken in decades, but truth alone cannot undo inheritance. That son would later vanish into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Some said he became a prophet, others claimed he was swallowed by the earth. Shemihaza never looked for him. Not because he did not care, but because he feared what he might find, either bones or a man too holy to face. So he wandered, always watching, always remembering, but never speaking. His sons ruled and he wept. They called his name and he turned away. They asked for blessings and he gave them silence, not out of hatred, out of guilt too deep for words. The heavens remained closed to him. He no longer prayed. He no longer dreamed. He merely endured. And every day the weight of what he had birthed grew heavier in his bones. He aged, not as men age, but as sorrow does, slowly, deeply, relentlessly. And yet in his silence he carried hope, fragile and flickering, that one day one of his sons would lay down their sword, would break their tower.
He's talking about the main fallen angel, Sam Zaka, whatever his name was.
Would whisper a name not in conquest, but in repentance. He did not know if that day would come, but he waited. And so he stood again at Ardis, at the place where he first touched the earth, looking out over the world he helped break. He opened his hands, once strong, now trembling, and lifted them to the dimming sky. No words came. No thunder answered, but the wind changed ever so slightly, as if somewhere something still listened. What revelation lies beyond the veil of this moment? What truth has yet to rise? The days grew quieter after that, not because the world had calmed, but because Shemihaza had stopped seeking the sound of his name. He no longer walked the cities his sons ruled, nor watched the fires that rose from their altars. Instead, he wandered the spaces between, abandoned valleys, dried riverbeds, cracked roads once paved with blood-soaked glory. It was in these places, untouched by conquest and forgotten by song, that his thoughts became prayers, not to be answered, but to be released. He had grown tired of holding silence inside his chest, where it swelled like storm clouds and never rained. Now he let the wind carry his sorrow, scattered in pieces too small to be gathered again. His wings had withered, not from punishment, but from the simple truth that flight cannot live where the heart has turned heavy. He once stood at the edge of a ruined orchard, where fig trees had once bloomed thick with sweet fruit. their leaves large enough to shade entire families from the sun's judgment. Now only splintered trunks remained, bark curling like burnt scrolls, their roots clawing at soil too exhausted to offer life. Here he remembered a time before his fall, before the pact, before the longing had overcome him. He had looked down from the heights of heaven and seen the earth wrapped in morning light, rivers breathing, birds dancing over the face of the deep, and he had mistaken beauty for emptiness. He believed presence required
Oh,
participation,
dog, come on,
that to
then.
witness the divine rhythm of creation without touching it
Bloody
was to
dog.
betray its purpose. So he descended, not out of rebellion, but out of hunger to belong to something living. But now he knew some beauty must remain untouched. Some fires burn only when approached. In a cave carved into the side of a forgotten hill, he found markings, symbols etched long before his sons had been born, their meanings twisted with age. These were not the sigils of giants nor the signs of men, but something older, shapes that pulsed with meaning even after centuries of dust had settled. He ran his fingers across the carvings and felt a cold truth slide beneath his skin. Others had fallen before him. Beings who had also reached beyond their station, who had touched what was forbidden, not out of hatred, but desire. Their names were no longer spoken, their shapes erased from memory, but their warnings remained. He sat in the mouth of the cave for hours, watching light shift across stone, listening not for voices, but for the absence of judgment. The cave did not condemn him, it only remembered. The memory that hurt him most came not from violence, but from stillness. He had once watched his youngest son sleep. The boy was no more than a handful of years, though his strength had already begun to shimmer beneath his skin. He had curled like any child would, arms tucked beneath his head, lips parted slightly in peace. In that moment,
Come on, up or
Shemihaza had
down.
felt something impossible, the weight of innocence in a being who
Come
would
here,
one day
gentlemen.
level
Put you
mountains with a
Some of
single
this.
blow. He had wanted to reach out, to place his hand on the boy's head and bless him with a future that would never come, but he could not, because he knew. The world had no room for innocence born of forbidden love. The skies would never forget the origin of that child's breath, and no matter how gently he dreamed, the flood would still come for him. So instead of touching his son, Shemihaza turned away and wept into a cloak that had once shimmered with heavenly light, now dulled by dirt and ash. His sons did not speak of him often in those years. They invoked his title when they wished to impress men, chanted his name in rituals meant to bend the weather or crush rebellions. But privately, they no longer sought him. Not because they did not believe, but because they no longer knew how to love what reminded them of their origin. He had become a symbol, not a father. A monument of guilt carved into the bedrock of their identity. And he too began to forget the sound of their laughter, the way their footsteps echoed through the halls of their youth. Time had turned them into stories, and stories, once hardened, lose the softness of memory.
Whether you're on a bike or in a car, we're all just people on the move. By doing little things when riding, like wearing brightly coloured clothing so others can see us more clearly, we can all look out for each other. Why does managing your expenses sometimes feel like this? Up to your eyeballs in admin? Oh dear. Lost in fuel card chaos? How many cards? Drowning in fuel receipts? Anyone say July 25th? Why can't things be easier? Don't ask why. Ask Wex Motorpass. Simplified, effortless, widely accepted. Search Wex Motorpass.
You do know you're not alone in this, don't you?
He once came across a dying village on the edge of the eastern hills. The people there did not recognize him. His face had changed. His stature had withered. He looked more like a prophet than a fallen one. A woman offered him water from a cracked bowl, her hands trembling from hunger. He drank, not because he needed to, but because it was offered. In that act, something sacred passed between them, not redemption, but recognition. She did not ask who he was, she only said, "Even the angels forget how to speak kindness." He nodded and left before the sun rose. He did not want her to see what remained of his wings. In the heat of the southern wastes, he buried a scroll, not one of magic nor prophecy, but memory. A piece of parchment he had carried for centuries, on which he had written no names, only questions. Not the kind meant to be answered, but the kind that echo in the soul long after breath fades. He pressed it into the sand with his bare hands, covered it with stone, and whispered, "If anyone finds this, may they ask not what we were, but what we failed to
Come on.
become." He never returned to that place, but he dreamed of it often. A mound of stone that hummed with sorrow, surrounded by silence too deep to disturb. Years passed, or centuries. He no longer counted. Time no longer moved in lines. It pooled around him like fog, heavy and shifting. He heard rumor.
Oh, bloody hell, Moo. Are you serious? Can you ever not do that?
He heard rumors of angels descending again, not in rebellion, but in mercy. He heard tales of fires falling from the sky, not to punish, but to cleanse. He listened to stories carried by wind and dust of men rising up with tongues that burned and hearts that remembered. And in those stories, he did not find fear. He found longing. Perhaps, he thought, the world would learn. Perhaps memory could become scripture and scripture could become breath. Perhaps one day a child would be born who did not carry his blood but carried his ache. And in that child's voice the heavens might hear something holy again. He walked until his feet bled, until his voice no longer reached even the nearest trees. He sat beneath a sky so still it felt like stone. And there, in the stillness, he did something he had not done since the beginning. He prayed, not for forgiveness, not for release, but for understanding, that someone, somewhere, might know the difference between a fall and a sacrifice, that someone might hear the story of a watcher who once loved too deeply and see not a monster, but a father who never stopped mourning. What revelation lies buried in silence, waiting for a heart willing to listen? The mountains had faded behind him, swallowed by distance and time, their jagged edges no longer sharp enough to wound the sky. Shemihaza walked through the lowlands now, where fog curled around his feet like
Shemahaza,
forgotten
there you
prayers,
go.
and the ground was soft with the memory of floodwaters long withdrawn. Here the world felt quieter, not healed, but tired. Trees bent not from wind, but from age, their branches hanging like arms too weary to lift offerings. The air tasted of old moss and stone, and every step left behind no mark, as if the earth itself had chosen to forget who walked upon it. He no longer expected recognition from the land. It had every right to turn its face from him. Still he moved forward, not out of duty, not from punishment, but because he had nothing left to turn back toward. The past was a closed gate, and the future remained silent. He came to a river one dusk, narrow, shallow, with waters so still they reflected not the sky, but the soul. There were no fish, no reeds, only silence wrapped in water. He knelt beside it, cupped his hands, and watched as the current passed through without pausing. He had not felt thirst in many years, but still he drank, if only to remember what need had once felt like. Across the bank stood a child, small and cloaked in shadow, holding a piece of bark etched with symbols too old for speech. Their eyes met, and for a moment time bent, not backward, but inward. The child did not speak, neither did he. But something passed between them, heavier than words, lighter than air. When he blinked, the child was gone. The bark remained on the opposite shore, untouched. He did not cross to retrieve it. Whatever truth it held was not meant for him. As the days darkened, his body thinned. His once glorious frame had already bowed under years of grief, but now it softened, as though the very bones within him had begun to dissolve. He no longer cast a strong shadow. Birds no longer avoided him. Even the wind passed through him gently, as if sensing that he no longer bore the same weight. He found himself speaking aloud, not to anyone, but to the fading edges of memory. He recited names that had not been spoken in millennia, each syllable cracked and rough, each one falling like dust onto ground that refused to bloom. He did not weep. His tears had been emptied long ago, buried with the last of his hope beneath an unmarked cairn in the desert. What remained was not sorrow, but reverence, a quiet acceptance that some stories were not meant to be rewritten, only remembered. One evening, beneath a sky heavy with stars that had stopped blinking, he carved a final message into the bark of a dying tree. Not a confession, not a warning, only a single line. We were not gods. We were lost. He pressed his hand to the trunk, and for a moment it pulsed, not with life, but with recognition. The tree did not bloom. The sky did not tear. But something in the wind shifted, not direction, but tone, as if the breath of the world had paused to listen. He closed his eyes and sat at the base of the tree, resting his back against what still stood, letting his body sink into the hush that followed. He could feel the weight of generations above him, their echoes buried deep in the soil, their choices layered into the roots. He remembered a night long ago before the descent, when he had stood on the edge of heaven watching the stars sing. He had not yet chosen rebellion. He had not yet tasted longing. He had only wondered what it meant to feel. That wondering had become hunger. That hunger had become action. And now, millennia later, it had become silence. He did not know if it had been worth it, but he knew the cost. And sometimes knowing the cost is all that remains when forgiveness feels too distant to name. As the wind thickened with nightfall, he whispered a name he had never spoken aloud, the name of the child he had never claimed, born of a woman who had vanished before the stars could remember her face. The boy had grown wild, unblessed, unnamed, and vanished like mist. Shemihaza had seen him once, from a distance, leading others through the rubble of a collapsed city, teaching them not spells or secrets, but silence. They had not spoken, but something in the way the boy moved, careful, listening, told him the child had known and forgiven, not with words, but with distance. That had been enough. He rose slowly, bones groaning like old trees, and began walking again. There was no destination, only the feeling that the ground beneath him still held stories waiting to be heard. He passed fields where birds had forgotten how to sing, valleys where echoes no longer returned. In each silence, he left something behind.
Mobile reception isn't going to fix the car, mate.
Our business mobile plans give you flexible 5G Australia-wide coverage from $25 a month. Aussie broadband. That's the actual Aussie way.
This is a farce. Since when did we become the targets?
When you're ready to choose a super fund, it pays to look at long-term investment performance and fees, because small differences now can have a big impact over a lifetime of savings.
At Hammond Care, we've been caring for people for more than 90 years. So if you need home care, dementia care, palliative care, call Hammond Care.
A breath, a wordless thought, a final glance. These were his offerings now, not sacrifices of flesh, but the surrender of memory. He had carried too much for too long, and now he gave it back. To the stones, to the wind, to the unseen. When his body finally failed beneath the branches of a tree that no longer bore fruit, there was no thunder, no fire, no divine hand reaching from the sky. Only stillness. A leaf fell, a breeze passed. Somewhere in the distance, a single bird lifted into the air. And beneath that silent tree, the last watcher closed his eyes, not in despair, but in release. And if the world ever finds his resting place, they will not find bones or books, they will find silence. And in that silence, a single question carved faintly into the bark. If a father dies weeping for his sons, does the sky remember the tears, or only the fire that followed? There was a morning when the heavens did not answer, not with fire, not with thunder, not even with silence. The skies simply turned their face away, not out of rage but weariness, not in punishment but in mourning. And beneath that heavy hush, a city stood trembling, though no one dared to say why. It was a place carved by giants, ruled by men who bore angelic blood but mortal breath. Its towers scraped the belly of the
They spoke flowery, didn't they, Lynn?
clouds. Its walls were etched with the names of those who claimed to speak on behalf of stars. They did not pray out of longing. They prayed out of tradition, with chants polished like coins and rituals performed with hands that no longer trembled. Their voices rose every dawn, echoing through the stone chambers, layered with incense and pride. But on that day, nothing returned. No echo, no wind, no shimmer in the clouds, just absence. The priests noticed it first, not the silence, but the lack of resistance. Their prayers usually stirred the air, shook the ground slightly, made the torches flicker even without flame. But today, the air stood still, heavy like breath held too long. Birds did not cry, leaves did not stir. Even the river that cut through the southern edge of the city moved slower, as if time itself had thickened. One of the elders stepped outside the temple, barefoot, wrapped in linen marked with the 7 symbols of ascent. He lifted his arms, palms open to the sky, and called the oldest name they knew, a name given to them by the watchers in the first days of descent. It had once opened the skies like a door. Now it barely passed his lips. The wind did not answer, the clouds did not shift. The name hung in the air for a moment, then fell like dust. There had been warnings carved into the walls of the caves beneath the temple. Glyphs not written by their scribes, but older hands. Some said they were made by those who remembered the heavens before light. The glyphs told of a day when the sky would no longer listen, when the prayers of men would bounce back hollow, when the stones would remember, but refuse to speak. The priests had buried those walls behind golden veils, hung lanterns to distract the eye, and trained children never to speak of what they saw. Fear was not good for obedience. Hope was easier to manage. But deep down, they knew. Every unanswered chant, every failed ritual, every sacrifice that brought no blessing. It had been coming, the forgetting, and now it had arrived. The people didn't notice immediately. They still lit fires, still sang the sunrise hymns, still pressed their offerings into the cracks of the altar. But something was different. The warmth they expected did not come. The glow that once wrapped their voices like wings remained dull. Mothers felt it first, their lullabies fell flat, their dreams too quiet. Children became restless. Animals refused to enter the temple's outer gates. And those who lived closest to the edge of the city swore the stars had stopped moving, as if waiting for someone to remember what had been forgotten. But no one spoke of it aloud. They were afraid that naming the silence would give it power. So they kept performing, louder, longer, more extravagant, as if sound could replace presence, as if volume could force heaven's ear to bend. There was one man who did not join them, a scribe, old and bent, who had copied every sacred text by hand, who had inked prayers even he no longer believed. He sat in a chamber beneath the city, surrounded by scrolls he had written, some burned at the edges from angry kings who didn't like the truths they revealed. He knew this silence, not because he was holy, but because he had seen it before. Long ago, in another city, buried now beneath layers of sand and shame, he had witnessed the same withdrawal, the same moment when the sky, so patient, so generous, turned still. That city had fallen, not in fire, but in forgetting. Its people stopped singing, stopped planting, stopped breathing as if breath had meaning. And now it was happening again. He placed his final scroll on the floor and whispered to no one, "We ask for answers, but never for forgiveness." At the city's edge, a girl stood alone. She was not a priest, nor royal, nor chosen. She cleaned the temple floors at dusk, carried water to the stone basins, and listened more than she spoke. That morning, she had felt the change before opening her eyes. Her chest had felt hollow, not from sickness, but from absence, like something had been pulled from the air, something she didn't have words for. She walked through the city with a jug balanced on her head, watching the priests sing louder, watching the smoke rise but fail to reach the sky. She saw birds land and not take off. She saw a man cry beside an unlit altar. And she understood, not with knowledge, but with knowing, the kind of knowing that does not require books, only breath. She stepped behind the temple into the old gardens where nothing grew anymore and knelt in the dust. She did not speak. She just sat, letting the silence wash over
Good
her
night,
like
I
water.
was. God bless.
Elsewhere, in the highest tower, the city's ruler stood wrapped in robes that shimmered with threads soaked in rare oils. His hands were covered in rings, each inscribed with invocations stolen from tablets long lost to flood and flame. He had called a council that morning, demanding answers. Why had the sky turned cold? Why had the wind stopped carrying their words? Why had the dreams become still? His advisors shuffled, eyes downcast, afraid to speak what they all feared, that perhaps they were no longer being ignored, but abandoned. One brave soul stepped forward and said, "Perhaps the heavens do not refuse us. Perhaps they wait for us to listen." The king dismissed him, not out of anger, but panic. He could not rule a city without the illusion of favor, and so he declared a great offering, hundreds of animals, an ocean of chants, days of ritual, and still the sky
Sorry,
did not
mate.
stir.
Have a good
By
weekend.
nightfall, the stars began to disappear, not all at once, slowly, one by one, as if someone had begun extinguishing them with care, like candles at the end of a vigil. People gathered in the streets, pointing, murmuring, unsure whether to scream or whisper. No one had ever seen such a thing. Some claimed it was a sign of mercy, others a sign of judgment. The priests danced until their feet bled. The king wept in private. The scribe burned his scrolls. And the girl, still in the garden, looked up and whispered, "I can still hear you, even if you don't speak." And in that moment, for a breath that no one else noticed, one star flickered back to life. Not above the temple, not above the palace, but above the place where she sat, barefoot in the dust. That night, no prayers were answered, no dreams were sent, but the earth slept softer, as if holding its breath for something sacred. And in that silence, a question hung above them, unseen but felt, etched into the hush like a scar on the sky's face. When the heavens refuse your voice, do you keep speaking? Or do you finally start listening? In the days that followed, the silence became its own kind of sound. It filled
That's a pretty good question.
to the spaces where drums once thundered and voices once rose in layered chant. The city began to shift in ways too quiet for records. The fabric sellers stopped dyeing their cloths in temple colors. The children stopped drawing the symbols of the divine in the dust, and the bakers left fewer loaves near the altar gates. No one declared that prayer had failed. No one admitted the sky had closed. Yet all could feel it, like walking into a familiar room where something is missing, but no one can name it. The light had not changed, yet the shadows no longer fell in the same direction. It was as if some breath had left the world and everything continued only because it didn't know how to stop. The priests grew pale from sleep loss, their bodies thinned by rituals stretched longer each day. They spoke louder, their mouths dry with effort, invoking every forgotten name they could recall. Ancient words they had once buried for fear of misuse were now dragged back into daylight. They painted their faces with soot, tore their robes in rehearsed sorrow, and walked barefoot through streets, hoping pain could summon presence. But the heavens remained silent, as if unmoved by performance, as if waiting for something they had forgotten how to offer. Even the temple animals, once docile in the presence of incense and song, began to stir nervously. Birds beat their wings in cages, oxen refused to kneel. The air no longer calmed their movements.
Why the frustration, the chaos, the complexity? Don't ask why, ask Wexmo.
If you follow your feelings here, you will sense the mana that flows in all things. Feel treasured in the islands of Tahiti.
Running empty's a bit of a pain. At Origin, we're helping you keep your LPG topped up with simple orders through our app.
It had become heavy, like a lid sealed over fire. In the corners of the city, whispers grew louder, not in rebellion, but in fear. Some believed the gods had left. Others claimed the giants were returning. A few muttered that a new name had been spoken in the dark, one that did not belong to temples, but to something older, something buried. Old women gathered near wells and murmured stories they had not shared since they were children. Stories of a time before the Watchers, before chants and columns and gold. They spoke of voices that could be, heard only in stillness, of prayers not shouted but breathed between moments of labor and tears. One woman, nearly blind, said, "The sky has not turned from us. We forgot how to speak with our hearts." No one responded, but the silence around her seemed to listen. The king, desperate to reclaim divine favor, summoned his advisors beneath the central dome. Maps were spread, Calculations made, offerings doubled. He ordered the excavation of ancient vaults beneath the city, forbidden places once sealed by his ancestors. There, beneath layers of stone and sacred denial, they unearthed a tablet too old to read. Its surface was cracked, but one phrase remained untouched. When the sky is quiet, it waits for truth. The inscription was hidden from the people. The king feared that truth would be mistaken for weakness. Instead, he declared that the silence was a test, a passage towards something greater. He proclaimed a festival of devotion, lights, music, sacrifice. The people obeyed, but they no longer danced with joy. They danced with aching feet and hollow eyes, unsure whether their devotion reached further than their rooftops. The girl from the garden returned each dusk to the withered fig tree behind the temple. She never lit candles, she never chanted. She simply sat, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the sky as if trying to remember a face she had never seen but always known. She spoke only once each night, not to demand, not to ask, but to share. She spoke of what she saw. A crippled bird learning to walk again, a child who laughed in his sleep, a loaf of bread given to a stranger with no name. She offered these moments not as proof, but as gift. And while the city's rituals grew louder, her prayers remained soft.
Freaking hell.
One evening,
You are
as the
one
stars
hell of a
began to
dog.
dim,
You are
the
so
wind
high
moved
maintenance.
through the garden. Not strong,
Will you stop
not
it?
cold, but warm and
Come
slow,
on, hop up.
curling through the branches like breath returning to lungs long
I'm
forgotten.
not picking you up
In
again.
the northern quarter, the old scribe began to hear voices in his sleep. Not nightmares, not prophecy, just fragments. Songs without endings, questions without punctuation, names he had never written but somehow remembered. He wrote them down each morning in ink made from crushed ash and wine. He did not show them to anyone. He burned each page after reading it once. They are not meant to be held, he said to himself, only passed through. The fire that consumed the scrolls gave no smoke, only warmth, as if the words themselves had asked for release. And so the city continued, not in faith, not in disbelief, but in habit. Children still played, but their songs had changed. Merchants still bartered, but with less laughter. The temple bells still rang, but fewer looked up when they did. And somewhere beneath all that noise, something new began to breathe. A reverence without choreography, a devotion without performance. It was not spoken. It was not taught. It moved like roots in soil, slow, unseen, quiet. But it moved. The sky had not turned in wrath. It had waited, not for grand displays, not for louder voices, but for honesty, for someone to speak without demand, to listen without expectation, to remember without fear. And though no thunder fell, no pillar of flame descended, something had shifted, a stillness deeper than silence, a closeness that felt like breath. It did not answer the prayers they had shouted, but it had heard the ones they had forgotten they whispered. What revelation lies in the quiet acts, the unseen, the unspoken, that carry more truth than 1,000 shouted prayers. Night returned without fanfare, settling over the city like a slow breath. The torches lit along the temple walls cast long shadows, but none reached the heavens. The stars, fewer now, blinked dimly as if from behind a veil, distant and undecided. No one spoke of miracles anymore. The chants had grown softer, not from reverence, but fatigue. The rituals continued, but their rhythm was mechanical, drained of the trembling urgency they once held. There were no more visions, no voices rising in the smoke, only the steady pulse of a people learning, perhaps for the first time, how to move without being seen. Beneath the great dome, where golden light once danced against polished stone, the priests stood in stillness. Their hands, once raised with certainty, now hovered in hesitation. One reached out to the altar, fingers brushing its edge, not to offer, but to feel if it was still warm. It wasn't. The silence had not lifted, but it had changed shape. What once pressed against the city like a judgment now lingered like a companion, quiet and observant. It no longer demanded, it simply existed. And within that stillness, something ancient began to stir, not in the temples or palaces, but beneath the soil, beneath the old streets where forgotten wells whispered, beneath the homes of mothers who prayed not in public, but over their sleeping children, in the hands of potters shaping clay without words, in the hearts of those who gave without seeking blessing in return. There, in the hidden acts of survival, the silence found something it recognized, not obedience, but sincerity. The girl continued her evening ritual beside the dead fig tree. Each night she arrived, not with flowers or incense, but with presents. Her silence was never empty. She carried stories in her eyes, memories not of power, but of kindness witnessed when no one was looking. A blind man given shade, a child fed without being asked.
You don't know the dog,
stranger walked
Diane.
across stones, sharp with judgment. She spoke these moments not upward but outward, not to beg, not to question, but to offer. And though no wind stirred, the dust beneath her feet began to settle slower, as if the ground
Lynn, she's
itself
got something wrong with her
leaned in to
voice.
listen. One night, she closed her eyes and
She's
whispered,
got a closed trachea.
"If you are waiting,
Trachea's closing. We're doing all we can, but we're doing what we can. That's about it. We've been to the pound. We've been to the doctors. We've been everywhere we could. But she's got tracheal infection. Tracheal enlargement. We can't do much about it."
for something more honest, I will wait with you." Her voice did not echo, but the air, for a breathless second, tasted like rain that had not yet fallen. Elsewhere, the old scribe burned his final page. He had no more words to give. What remained inside him now was not a scroll or sermon, but silence shaped by experience. He sat beside his cold hearth, watching embers fade, and thought not of the prayers that were never answered, but of the ones that never needed to be spoken. He remembered a young woman who had once asked him if silence was a punishment. He had said yes then. Now he wasn't sure. Perhaps silence was the divine's way of letting us speak freely, without correction. Perhaps it was the sky's gift, not a rejection, but a retreat, so we could learn to rise on our own. He leaned his head back, eyes closed, and listened, not to sound, but to the absence of it. It no longer frightened him. It felt like being held. The king, once fierce in his proclamations, grew quiet as well. The scrolls no longer gave him comfort. The rituals failed to rouse awe. His guards noticed he walked alone more often, sometimes barefoot, pausing beside ordinary people with no titles. He did not...
Okay, ask who this was before, Lynn. Listening to it, I don't know who Shamyaz is. I know of him as that Azazel. It's so. I wonder how they're one and the same.
Speak of his visions. He had none left. But he began to listen, to weavers, to fishermen, to mothers, to the...
Because if this one here is an evil, he's sowing a lot of sad stuff for his son.
girl behind the temple. One morning, he passed a shepherd boy who asked if he believed the sky was angry. The king, without ceremony, knelt and answered, "I think it's waiting." The boy nodded as if he understood and walked away. The king remained kneeling for a long time, letting the dust cling to his knees like prayer. The city never received a sign, no fire, no pillar, no voice descending in thunder, but the people changed. They still sang, but softer. They still gave offerings, but
Next level dog people give their dogs next level protection with NexGuard Spectra. It's the most complete protection against fleas.
I've heard of the Book of Giants before, but it was never this detailed. This has been going, how long has it been going? An hour and 20 minutes, and there's still these go. I've read the Book of Giants before, and there's not that much words in it, so I wonder what's going on here.
Ticks, mites, worms, and even heartworm, all in one tasty monthly chew. Next level protection with NexGuard Spectra.
As an architect, I've always wished there could be one trusted partner for all my lightweight wall and ceiling building.
But now they shared them with the poor first. They still told stories of the Watchers and the old names, but they began to tell other stories too, of silent strength, of kindness given in secret, of prayers whispered without expectation. The sky, though quiet, felt closer, not in sound but in weight. It pressed gently against their bones, not to crush them, but to remind them they were being held. Not every night brought peace, not every morning brought joy, but there was a steadiness now, a sacred stillness that lingered in the spaces between breath. And so, years passed. The temple did not crumble, but it no longer stood as the center. The fig tree never bore fruit again, but it stood green for the first time in generations. The girl grew older, her hair touched with silver, but she still returned each evening to the same spot. She no longer waited for a reply. She spoke because speaking had become holy, because silence had taught her that presence is more faithful than volume. And the sky, though still, remained, watching, listening, holding the weight of every word, every pause, every act of quiet belief. And in the end, when people asked what changed, no one could name a moment. There was no miracle, no fire from above, only the memory of a season when the skies refused their prayers, and yet somehow they became holy anyway. What divine purpose lay hidden in that quiet, waiting to be uncovered by the listener's heart?
Okay, I see someone's commented, hang on.
Of gold. That was a later invention, crafted by men who mistook glitter for glory. The true seats of the giants were carved from obsidian and bone, shaped not to dazzle but to endure. They were heavy beyond measure, rooted deep into the floors of the cities they ruled, as if anchored not just to stone but to consequence. Each throne sat atop a hollow, not for comfort, but for concealment. Beneath those great seats of power, dug with hands that remembered the structure of the stars, lay chambers that no...
Well, that's what this guy's saying. It come from Enoch. So, okay, is this the second Enoch or the third Enoch or the first Enoch? Depends on the Enoch whether it's true or not.
Fire touched and no chant reached. The giants sat tall in the sunlight, but what they feared most lay in the dark below their feet, and they buried it with care. The first of these hidden chambers was built after the fall of the eldest among them.
Okay, as far as I know.
Giant who had named him...
My voice is still hoarse.
...himself eternal, but fell weeping into the sea when his children turned on one another. His bones were never found, but his crown surfaced days later, blackened by salt and cracked clean down the middle. The survivors, afraid the same fate would consume them, began building vaults beneath their thrones, not to store treasures, but to hide reminders, records of mistakes, the remnants of forbidden rites, relics that whispered the price of pride. They told no one, not their priests, not their scribes, not even their heirs. These vaults became inheritance by omission. A lineage not of blood, but of buried guilt. Mahaway had once been allowed into one of these chambers, long before he began writing his scrolls. He had been summoned not as kin, but as witness. The throne belonged to Olkia, his half-brother, whose rule stretched from the northern hills to the glass desert, where lightning struck without warning. Olkia had spoken little as they descended the narrow stone stairwell, their footsteps echoing like quiet warnings. The door was not sealed with locks, but with silence. A sacred silence that could not be broken unless one carried both memory and remorse. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of...
Is Lucifer Satan, Lynn? I wonder which it is.
Iron and old weapons. The chamber had no jewels, no idols. Only stone tablets, each one cracked, each one inscribed with the names of the forgotten. There were names Mahawe did not recognize, names scratched out in haste, names followed by marks that looked like weeping eyes. One tablet bore the outline of a handprint, too small to be giant, burned into the stone as if placed there by something divine in protest. In the corner, a scroll rested in a glass urn, wrapped in cloth stitched with human hair. Oya did not explain it. He simply stood in silence, his jaw set, his eyes refusing to meet Mahawe's. When they left the chamber, nothing was spoken. It was not a moment of confession. It was an act of survival, as if sharing the weight, even for a breath, kept it from collapsing the throne above. Other giants had their own vaults. Some were filled with ash from cities erased without war. Others held broken instruments, tools meant to bend the will of earth and water, now rusted into quiet submission. There were maps etched on animal hide, depicting lands that no longer existed. Islands swallowed by the sea, mountains leveled into dust, forests that had once whispered secrets, but now stood hollow. One chamber, beneath the throne of Armaros the Dreamer, was said to contain nothing but mirrors, not for vanity but punishment. Each mirror reflected not the present, but a moment of failure, the exact breath in time where mercy was denied, where power was chosen over humility. Armaros visited it every new moon. Some claimed he screamed each time he left. Others said he emerged smiling, which was worse. None of these vaults were ever spoken of in public. To admit their existence would be to crack the myth of perfection the giants wore like armor. Their thrones had to appear unshakable, their laws unquestionable, their memories flawless. But beneath their feet, the truth trembled. They sat on kingdoms built over confession, and every time their weight shifted, something groaned beneath the stone, not from structure, but from spirit, a reminder that power does not erase sin, it only buries it deeper. The younger generations of giants did not
It's quite detailed, isn't it, Lynn?
visit these places. They were taught only the stories written on the walls of their courts, stories of triumph, of divine favor, of strength unmarred by doubt. They knew nothing of the scrolls hidden in clay jars beneath their very rooms, scrolls inked by fathers whose hands shook from grief. They never saw the broken staffs snapped in two during the days when the heavens grew distant. They never heard the whispered warnings carved into the pillars behind their thrones, warnings written in languages older than the cities themselves, languages not meant to be spoken, only read in silence. It was not until the flood began, slow at first, like breath pulling away, that the vaults were remembered. The earth cracked in strange patterns. Storms rose in places where skies had never wept. And the giants, desperate to preserve the parts of themselves they could no longer carry, returned to the hollows beneath their thrones. Some added new relics, letters never sent, apologies never spoken, dreams that showed the end but were ignored. One giant, whose name was wiped from every record after, buried his own heart there, not as a symbol, but literally. He carved it from his chest and placed it in a bowl of black sand, whispering to it until his voice failed. The story said his body stood for 3 days after his soul had gone, then collapsed into dust. Not all vaults survived. Many were lost when the cities sank, when the flames consumed the last sacred halls, when time sealed the entrances with rock and silence. But some remain, beneath hills no longer named, under ruins, too dangerous to map, inside mountains where the wind still howls with ancient names. And what lies inside them is not power, it is not prophecy, it is memory, unspoken, unfinished, unresolved. What else then do we still sit upon in our own lives, pretending the ground beneath us is clean? The soil beneath the thrones was never still. It shifted with memory, with weight, with the breath of things long sealed but never forgotten. The giants had believed they could contain regret, that it could be entombed in stone and silenced with ritual. But sorrow does not decay like flesh. It waits. And as the days lengthened and the skies grew stranger, the hollows beneath their seats began to stir. Not with voices, not with movement, but with presence. A trembling that pulsed through the stone floors during moments of stillness, like the echo of an old song trying to find its voice again. Those who were sensitive to such things, servants, healers, children too young to know fear, began to feel it first. They would pause mid-step, eyes wide, hands clutching the air, as if trying to steady something unseen. They could not explain it, but they knew the ground was remembering. In one city, perched atop a mountain that had once been flattened by a fallen star, the throne of a warrior giant began to crack. Not from pressure, but from within. The stone, polished for generations, split along lines that followed no pattern, as if something beneath had begun to breathe. The council gathered in panic, searching for signs of sabotage. None were found. No tunnels, no enemies, no fire. Just a silence growing heavier with each passing hour. The oldest among them, a woman who tended the sacred library and had outlived 2 floods, stood before the shattered throne and whispered, "It has returned." When asked what she meant, she simply walked away. That night, the vault beneath that city was found open, its seal broken from the inside, though no doors had been moved.
That sounds like how it's going to be when the restrainer stands up. That sounds exactly like that, doesn't it, guys?
The artifacts within were untouched, but they no longer felt inert. The air in the chamber vibrated faintly, like a drumskin brushed by wind. Scrolls, once sealed shut by time, now lay partially unrolled, their ink glistening fresh as if newly written. A mirror, long covered in cloth, had cracked from corner to corner, though no impact had occurred. Those who entered felt ill for days, not with disease, but with memory they could not place. Dreams followed them, thick and wordless, heavy with symbols they could not translate. Faces they had never seen, places they had never visited. And always the thrones loomed above, not as symbols of power, but as lids covering what should never have been buried. Some giants began to leave their cities, claiming pilgrimage, claiming prophecy. In truth, they fled from the weight below. They traveled to remote places, deserts where the wind erased footsteps, mountains where snow buried tracks, forests where the light rarely touched the floor. But no matter how far they ran, they felt it. That soft pull in their chest, that whisper behind the breath, reminding them that the ground remembers even when they pretend to forget. One giant, once beloved as a peacebringer, tore his throne apart with his own hands, hurling its fragments into the sea. When asked why, he replied, "If I must rule, let it not be over bones." but the waves returned the pieces 3 days later, each one washed clean, placed gently on the shore. The few who dared enter the vaults in search of truth rarely returned unchanged. One man, a scholar who served in the court of a forgotten city, documented his descent into a vault beneath the Hall of Thorns, a place known for its cruel laws and crueler kings. His writings, later found stitched into his cloak, spoke of walls that bled light and relics that hummed when touched. He described a pool of water that reflected not the face of the viewer, but their shame, every unspoken thought, every hidden cruelty, every moment they wished to erase. He wrote that when he tried to look away, the pool followed. He collapsed days later in a market square, eyes wide, silent until death. His final breath formed a single word: forgive. The servants who maintained the throne rooms began to notice strange patterns, cracks in the walls that resembled ancient glyphs, dust forming symbols only visible at dawn, sounds that echoed like footsteps below, though the vaults had not been opened in centuries. Some started leaving offerings beside the thrones, not flowers or coins, but tears, pieces of fabric, strands of hair, small notes scrawled with apologies no one had asked for. The giants never acknowledged these acts. They sat as always, tall, unmoved, composed, but their eyes began to shift more often. They blinked too slowly. Their hands gripped their thrones too tightly. And when they spoke, their voices carried the strain of someone trying to balance on a crumbling foundation. One day, in the capital of the Southern Plains, a child born during eclipse wandered into the throne room unattended. She walked barefoot across the sacred floor, trailing dust behind her, and placed her hand on the base of the throne.
So there is female fallen angels. I haven't heard that actually said, although I have wondered.
The queen, known for her silence and strength, did not stop her. She only watched. The child said, "It's crying," and walked away. That night, the queen descended into the vault alone. When she returned, she removed her crown, placed it in the center of the hall, and walked into exile. No words, no proclamation, just silence, deep and final. Across the scattered remains of the Nephilim's world, others began to feel the call, not a sound, not a voice, but a weight pressing from beneath, urging them to remember, to unbury, to reckon. And though the thrones still stood, tall and grim and glorious, those who sat upon them knew the truth. They did not sit above their past, they sat upon it. And what was buried does not always stay silent. What burden lives beneath the places we claim as power? And what happens when the weight we thought was stone begins to remember our names? The thrones remained long after their masters were dust. Their stones, once warmed by the weight of command, now stood cold and hollow in empty halls where ivy had crept across carvings meant to last forever. The cities around them had fallen quiet, not destroyed, but abandoned by the pride that once filled their streets. No war had taken them, no flood had swallowed them. They were left behind like worn-out dreams, places too heavy with memory to live in, too sacred and too cursed to destroy. Travelers passed through them without stopping, their eyes averted, their feet quickening as though the air itself resisted remembrance. But the thrones remained.
Okay, this is nearly half the show, guys. So I'm going to switch off and use this for another show. I'm going to switch off from this show here and switch to another one. Not the same. Hang on then.
Tall as ever, untouched by time, but trembling beneath it. For deep below, the vault still breathed. One of these cities lay beneath a cliffside, carved into the rib of a mountain that bore no name anymore. Its stone paths were slick with moss, its fountains dry, its statues leaning.
Okay. No, hang on. What's going on?
But without it, things would be even worse. There are no security guarantees except France and weapons. No Ukrainian choice this kind of reality.
Actually, hang on. Hang on, guys. Gotta do it the hard way. Got it. Oh, I got the. Oh, hang on. Ah, man. There it is. Oh, man, what's going on here? Okay, found it. Sorry about that, guys.
Gas isn't just helping the energy transition, it's in transition itself. Renewable gas, like biomethane, is being demonstrated and developed around Australia and already used successfully overseas. Renewable gas, part of the big picture.
Power and secrecy walk hand in hand. Hacking France at the news of the world has been endemic. Rupert Murdoch's explicitly encouraged it.
Only up to
There's a rupture that was just found this year off the coast right here. And if this thing has a mega thrust,
I'll play the second half of that on a quiet day. You know how sometimes we have not much to watch? That's the hardest thing with this channel, finding content to watch all the time. You just can't find it now. They just block it too much. Although I haven't had a strike for 2 years, guys. Knock on wood, geez, knock on wood.
earthquake, they're expecting 298,000 fatalities, and this sits right on the ring of fire. So the U.S. Navy didn't just retreat to one of the more dank. The U.S. military was forced to retreat after a powerful volcanic eruption shook. The eruption on Iwo Jima has forced the U.S. Navy to relocate carrier landing practice, unprecedented move. And the coming ripple effects could affect the entire Pacific and West Coast. Last time we seen Iwo Jima erupt, it was in 2023. But now, in September 2025, we can see the red underneath the ground billowing up, this submarine underwater volcano exploding, raising urgent questions about the Pacific Ring of Fire. At the same time, the Bay Area is rattled by back-to-back earthquakes. And on September 22nd, Monterey, California installs new tsunami evacuation sign. So what does this mean for millions of you across the Pacific and West Coast? And what is the military doing currently with their training being evacuated? After the underwater volcano erupted in the Pacific, U.S. Navy pilots will relocate carrier landings at Marine Corps Air Station Iwakuni due to ongoing volcanic activity on Iwo Jima. Iwakuni is a very highly unusual field practice site according to Japan's Ministry of Defense. The military will be forced to train here from now all the way to September 26th because of the magma building up underneath the Pacific. But this relocation isn't by accident. but it happens to be where the megaquake warning zone in Kaitro is. There's a large rupture that was just found this year off the coast right here. And if this thing has a mega thrust earthquake, they're expecting 298,000 fatalities, and this sits right on the ring of fire. So the U.S. Navy didn't just retreat to one of the more dangerous zones right next door to the volcanic eruption for no reason. Iwo Jima erupting and magma intrusion increasing is a sign that Pacific Ring of Fire pressure is building up, because this isn't just smoke at Iwo Jima volcano. This is part of a pressure chain along the Ring of Fire. And specifically could be something they're looking at pinpointing as they go and train off of one of the most dangerous zones. And a megaquake tsunami would disrupt the U.S. West Coast, Alaska, British Columbia for months. Supply chains would be totally no shipping for a while. Economic impacts would be very much in disastrous stages. Hawaii would.
Imagine how bad that'll be. How many has the US got? 350 or something? 350 mil?
Most likely get hit with tsunamis, and then the waves would travel for miles all the way down to the U.S. West Coast. And right now, they don't know how far these waves would travel, but they can reach the U.S. West Coast. Even if they don't, we're in a situation where that Fukushima waste as well starts to travel even more, even though it's already hit our coast. And if we map out the pressure right now along the Ring of Fire all over the West Coast, back-to-back earthquake hit Berkeley, California, and while media reported minor damage, some of the major damage reports went unnoticed. Lorraine Walker, a Berkeley, California resident house, split like this.
Now that's the feeling. Progress. With Newcastle Permanent's local home loan experts, we're here to help you get into your dream home faster. And we're here for good.
The process of fixing my roof, look what the earthquake just did. This is not minor damage.
Are we staring at the big one and a slow phase already happening? And why would Monterey, California go ahead and start putting up evacuation tsunami warning signs and getting people ready for the routes? And some of the locals are completely oblivious to what's going on. When you listen to what they say, I don't think they even know what's coming.
New tsunami signs are up across Monterey's waterfront as a part of a statewide push to standardize tsunami readiness. The city installed 5 signs, one at Fisherman's Wharf, 2 along Del Monte Beach, 1 at El Estero Park, and another at San Carlos Beach. The signs map out evacuation routes and explain what to do if a tsunami alert is issued. City leaders say the goal is to make the information easy to spot, but residents say the move feels unnecessary.
We've only ever had one tsunami warning ever since we've been here, and that was like maybe 5 feet. So I don't think it was necessary.
Emergency officials urge people to familiarize themselves with the routes now before an alert strikes.
Now let's look at the bigger West Coast picture. Let's go up a little bit more. And you got the wake of tsunami warning. Oregon lawmakers calling for better state disaster preparedness. They're looking for a $300 million package for statewide disaster facilities. And then if we go up a little bit more from Oregon, we got in British Columbia, they said, prepare for volcanic activity. It seems that everybody is aligned up here on the West Coast, the emergency officials, to step into something is coming type of preparedness level. This is why you need to stop right now and just hit that subscribe button, because we right now as a community have people monitoring Mount Rainier saying rocks are falling they haven't seen before, monitoring Mount St. Helens where the volcanic ash happened and saying that stuff is happening they haven't seen before, and they're looking at getting you videos. So you need to stay here as I deliver all of the information about the risk zones and everything else. because we will not let you down. We're bringing out all the crucial information about the tectonic shift that literally a lot of people are not even paying attention to. We need to watch for 4.0 through 5.0 hitting Japan or the U.S. West Coast. These
that's a
spikes
big-
usually show us
That's
that
a big
bigger
tsunami.
shift is at play. Number two, if the U.S. Navy's training is relocated again, unusually, this could tell us that the shift is moving faster than we even expected. Communities on the Pacific coast, from California, Washington, Oregon, even up to Canada areas and Alaska, they may start running tsunami drills out of nowhere. And we're not talking annual drills. We're saying they just up and started running tsunami drills as they bumped up their funding. This could signal to us as well that a major move is needed for preparation for an oncoming event. Now, that was in the coming days. In the coming weeks, we need to look at Cascadia subduction zone. We're going to watch those tremors, and we got to look at the Bay Area in California to see what occurs as these new quakes start to come. And you can give us videos if you smell sulfur, if you see ash fall out, or if you have these ground rumblings happening that's just really unusual, not something you've been hearing all the time. And that's how we're going to have this community warning signs for each other so that we can all bring this knowledge in the comment section, look between it, and then actually see before the authorities give out the final warning that we don't know when we'll get. One of the other big signs is that the Japanese authorities may issue new maps and guidances to the Japanese people. This will signal to us that they do see something happening either with the rupture and the magma intrusions and along the Ring of Fire. This will definitely be a bigger warning sign. But how do you stay updated with all that? You just stay here and subscribe. We have all this going for a reason because we want you to be aware. The other thing is strange animal warning signs. And I still think that it's strange that we look at the story here that ecologists found out they started migrating on the opposite of what usually is done, and they started breeding during non-breeding season while the other animals was breeding, and they started moving up towards areas like way past the Canada border, which a lot of the birds wasn't doing. It's like they was leaving towards the area where Yellowstone was at, which is interesting because maybe they sensed some heat signatures there. But here's the thing. As the environment shifts, so does the animal shift. That's a proven fact. It's confirmed. That's why we need to really pay attention to that. And if you get some information in, send it to me here.
At Hammond Care, we've been caring for people for more than 90 years. So if you need home care, dementia care, palliative care, call Hammond Care.
I'm Nikki Rigby and this is Yes Chef. Today I'm with Tim Casamatis and we are outside his restaurant, Olympic Meat.
And here's the tsunami map where you need to back up off of this zone. Even if you have a few minutes of time, you need to create a plan where you can get out of this yellow and greenish looking zone, because that's where most of the inundation from the tsunami is going to be at. And these facilities they want to build is pretty interesting because Jeff Merkley, the senator, asked for the funding, the disaster funding in Oregon to create these facilities when the tsunami and earthquake hit. And how would these facilities be facilitated is the question. This could be another scenario that we need to dive deeper into to see where they're being built, to see how they're being built, and to see what we know for a fact who's running them. FEM, and you know what the last letter is. I just don't want to trigger anything. That's why I'm not saying it. Whether you're newly tuning in, whether you've been here for years, we deeply care about you. And at this point that we're at right now, a lot of people have lost sense of reality, but we're here to bring that back once again, to bring back care, to love, respect between communities. And we actually want eventually for us to be able to respond as a team, as we're doing on the internet right now, that we will become that later in person. Because when these things do go down, community can make you or break you. And in 2005, when Hurricane Katrina, during that disaster, I saw the best and worst of humanity. I seen people turn their back on us and drive past us while we had no vehicle, stranded houses in the street, but also saw people come together and help us. Also seen a family cohesive unit, a positive-minded support group. And that's what gets you through all this stuff. Not always being in fear, having that positivity, praying. We prayed for like at least 5 hours in the attic that we didn't have. We broke a hole in.
I'm fascinated with tsunamis. I've watched all the ones you can watch on Japan. I don't know why. I just like to see. I don't like to see, but I'm surprised to see the destruction that comes with it.
And then seeing the water go down, heard people screaming, heard all the chaos. So people ask why you do it. This is why I do. Just 11 years old, I survived that. And obviously we won't survive everything, but the thing is that if you can, then you should try at least. Because you might have a mission to help somebody else in the future that you never knew you could help change. Imagine if I didn't care about surviving then, you wouldn't know me now. I appreciate every last one of you, but for survivability, you need to make sure.
Okay, guys, I'm off. God bless.
So people ask why you do it. This is why I do. I was 11 years old. I survived.
Good night, guys.
And obviously we won't survive everything, but the thing is that if you can,